You slide your chair in. You tuck into that warm couch, the one whose arms you know by heart. Ice from your drink beads and runs down the glass, tracing tiny rivers through the condensation. Outside, somewhere far away, mountains are doing what they've always done, shedding their skins in snow, silently, in winter, whether you remember they exist or not. 5,300 years ago, a man sat down on a glacier at 3,210 meters near the summit of the Finelspitz, on a saddle the maps now call Teisenjoch, on the modern-day border between Austria and Italy. He carried a finished copper axe. He carried a flint dagger with a fine ashwood handle. He carried a longbow, 14 arrows, and a birch bark quiver slung across his back. Around his body, he wore a cape of woven grass, leggings of carefully pieced animal hide, a bearskin hat with a chin strap, and shoes stuffed with grass for insulation. He was alone. The snow under him was older than his grandmother. And somewhere upslope above where he sat, a slab of bonded wind-packed snow rested on a hidden weak layer, that fragile, almost invisible thing that modern avalanche scientists call a depth hoar layer, a band of coarse, sugary crystals that cannot bond to the slab above it. He had no English word for it. He had no lectures on snow science. He had no avalanche forecasts pumped to his phone. He had only the cold, and his eyes, and the way the wind had been singing in a particular key all morning. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Most avalanches, in our era of transceivers and airbag backpacks and helicopters, still kill their victims in under 15 minutes. Study after study has confirmed the brutal arithmetic. According to data published by the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research in Davos, roughly 75% of avalanche fatalities are caused by asphyxiation. A 2024 analysis by Simon Rauch and his team at URAC Research in Bolzano found that the survival rate of fully buried victims drops from more than 90% within the first 10 minutes of burial to 76% at 15 minutes. By 90 minutes, only 27% of victims are still pulled out alive. By 130 minutes, just 3. The man on Teisenjoch was probably buried alive in some forgotten spill of snow for hours before a knife wound to his shoulder, likely inflicted days or months earlier by an enemy he never got to confront, finished him. He lay face up in a meltwater hollow until a hot September morning released the ice that had gripped him. His world did not reach him again for 5,200 years. September 19, 1991. So the question is simple. For thousands and thousands of years, with no transceivers, no airbag packs, no avalanche forecasts calibrated to the slope, no helicopters, no monuments to the snow, how did human beings survive in places where the mountains themselves were trying to bury them? Here's the part nobody talks about. Your intuition says ancient people must have died constantly in the high peaks, that the mountains were an unrewarding graveyard for anybody foolish enough to climb them. The archaeology says something subtler, stranger, and far more interesting. Starting in the late Mesolithic and accelerating into the Neolithic, people climbed high mountains all the time, and they lived to come back down. The Schneidjoch Pass, perched at 2,756 meters in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland, has produced one of the longest archaeological sequences of any high-altitude site in Europe. There, the archaeologist Albert Hafner of the University of Bern and his colleagues documented finds spanning roughly 6,000 years, Neolithic flint tools, a complete birch longbow preserved by sub-zero burial, fragments of plated willow rings, fragments of goatskin clothing, leather shoe parts, a wooden arrow shaft from the early Bronze Age, Roman coins, Iron Age arrowheads, medieval toggles and clothing. The oldest artifacts so far recovered from Schneidjoch date to roughly 4,500 BCE, and finds layer continuously up through to the medieval period. The avalanche question, then, is not whether people went there. They did. The question is why most of them walked back out. To answer that, you have to first understand what they were walking into. Today's avalanche science is built on a fact that fits cleanly on a postcard, if postcards were macabre. Roughly 90% of avalanche fatalities, every winter, in every mountain range, are caused by the same mechanism. A cohesive slab of wind-packed or settled snow is bonded to the slope. Underneath it lies a hidden weak layer. Often faceted crystals, a sun crust, a buried rain crust, a layer of depth are formed during a long cold snap when water vapor migrates up through the snowpack and redeposits as hollow cups. Tensile and shear stresses build as new snow piles on. A fracture races across the slope at speeds that have been measured at up to 60 meters a second. The slab, sometimes weighing hundreds of thousands of kilograms, begins to slide down the mountain like a freight train made of crystals. Picture the entire slope ahead of you ripping like a bedsheet. That is the avalanche. A colony of buried air pockets starts collapsing the moment the slide stops, snow hardening into cement as it settles. Carbon dioxide builds. Oxygen vanishes. You have minutes. And the people who love you have minutes. If that's what a slab does, and you have no transceiver, no probe, no science, no search and rescue helicopter on standby, you have only one weapon left. Do not be there when it goes. So the first weapon your ancestors carried was their eyes. They read the mountain like a language. Outsiders see a meadow. Mountain people see a graveyard and a warning. The faint concave curve where grass transitioned into scree at the bottom of an open bowl. The dark line of a wind-loaded ridge, where snow piled 2 meters deep where 50 centimeters lay a few meters away. The thin elliptical scar across a slope where a previous slide had stripped the soil down to bedrock, sometimes 100 meters wide. Long before any modern study confirmed it, communities mapped where not to build. If you've ever wondered why so many old alpine villages sit on the lee side of ridges, or on the knolls in the middle of the valley floor, instead of on pretty snowfields with glittering views, that's the answer. Think of villages like Tignes in France, rebuilt twice in a single generation after catastrophic December slides in 1942 and 1944, finally relocated to a stand of cliffs post-war by a town council that had absorbed the data the hard way. Think of the Walser hamlets of the Valais and the Ladine settlements tucked into the Dolomites. They were built the rest of their lives around the absent geometry of past slides, and their descendants built on top of their choices, and on top of those, theirs. Think about that for a second. The stone barns tucked against cliff walls. The south-facing villages you see in every tourism postcard. That is not charm. That is a population reading its own historical death toll into where it laid its foundations. To stand in a Walser hamlet in the Valais or a Ladine settlement in the Dolomites and feel the romance of it is to stand in a kind of mass grave that chose, generation after generation, to keep quiet about what it had seen. This knowledge was passed down like weather, by word and by example, by the older cousins who never let the younger ones out of sight. If a slope buried your grandfather in March, your father did not cross it in March. If a certain couloir in a certain year ate a flock of 60 sheep, your mother knew the story by the time she was 9. No maps, although maps eventually came. No charts, although charts eventually came. Just names, and the small shrine where the names began, half a kilometer closer to a stable slope. Of course, this memory could fail. One bad season, one catastrophic storm, one young man who didn't get the briefing. And then a slope forgets you, too. But here is what makes the system work across centuries when it does work. A landscape that forgets is a landscape that fills with tombstones. There is no abstract way to say this. The graveyard stayed empty where the memory stayed sharp. They filled where the memory turned to dust, and after that, the family line itself ended in those valleys. The second weapon ancient people used against the mountains might sound even more counterintuitive than the first. They refused to be there. They used the calendar. For thousands of years across the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Caucasus, the Andes, and the Himalayas, people organized their lives around when not to be on certain terrain. The practice, which UNESCO inscribed on its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2019 under the simple name transhumance, sent herders and their flocks up to high summer pastures in spring, and down again in autumn. The mountain was not for living on through winter. The mountain was for borrowing. In the Alps, seasonal dairymen called Sen in Austria, Senners in Switzerland, Almas in the Engadin, walked with their cows into the high meadows in late May and walked them out again before October's first settled snow. The mountain was theirs to graze only when the snowpack had consolidated into stronger, more stable slabs layered onto a thawing, refrozen ground that wasn't yet wet lubricated. They avoided crossing the high passes in spring, when warming sun triggered wet slides on the grassy, rocky slopes just above the freezing line. They did not negotiate these passes in deep winter, when wind loaded every gully and every couloir with fracture-prone pillows of fresh powder over fragile foundations. Walk the high passes in winter today and you will be met with sharp questions by descendants of those herders. Even children in modern ski towns will tell you which slope slide and when, often with a precision that rescues would later confirm. The passes were open in summer, when the snowpack had consolidated into strong slabs layered onto stable ground. They were dangerous in spring, on the wet snow bell curve of rising temperature. They were not negotiable in deep winter. The 6,000-year archive at Schneidjoch is not the story of people braving avalanches. It is the story of people who knew the window. They climbed in summer, when the snow was predictable, when the weak layers had healed under the sun. They did not climb when it wasn't. 60 centuries of finds preserved by ice show what a society successfully and repeatedly carried off of that mountain, across a glacier, through a col, into the next valley, and down again to the village where the cheese would ripen before the snow returned. 2 legs, a sheep, a string of pack horses, a butter churn, a pat of alpine cheese. They could not bet against a weak layer they could not see. So they bet against the season, and the season won fewer of their people than the slope would have if they had tried to climb it in February. Here's the part that quietly dismantles the obvious answer. The third weapon your ancestors carried was small, soft, made of wool and skin, and rarely talked about. Their clothes. The copper axe man on the Tysonjoch wore a cape of woven grass that has been reconstructed from textile impressions on his tools. He wore a bearskin hat with a chin strap. He wore hide leggings densely stitched with sinew, and shoes whose insides were packed with hay. None of this would have saved him from a slab weighing 1,000,000 kilograms sliding at highway speeds. Brutal physics doesn't care how your grandmother made your gloves. But it would keep him warm enough to function long enough to read the sky that morning and to walk home alive. Modern estimates for altitude at 3,210 meters in late spring, on a north-facing slope, with wind across the saddle, would put the wind chill below -20 Celsius within minutes. Clothes weren't fashion. They were portable infrastructure for staying alive in environments where the air itself was an aggressor. By the time Roman-era couriers, and afterwards the medieval merchant caravans of the Venetian Republic and the Bishopric of Milan, moved up the valleys each May, they were carrying what had worked for generations: greased wool capes that shed water, layered sheepskins whose natural lanolin resisted ice formation, foot wraps of braided straw that added an insulating air layer between the leather boot and the frozen ground, fur-lined hoods whose collars could be drawn across the face in a storm. The technology sounds humble. It isn't. It is the slow refinement of empirical survival engineering across roughly 12,000 years of human beings trying not to freeze to death between one valley and the next, and it carries forward, in continuous experiment, into every modern mountain jacket that you can buy in any ski town outfitter. The only real difference is the zipper, the synthetic fill, and the credit card bill. And sometimes, in places where the air itself was the enemy, the body quietly outwitted oxygen debt over generations. The Sherpa people of the high Tibetan plateau inherited a strange gift from a vanished cousin. Research published in 2014 by Amelia Huerta Sanchez and her colleagues at UC Berkeley identified a section of a gene called EPAS1 in Tibetans as nearly identical to a version carried by the extinct Denisovans, a sister group to the Neanderthals who once lived across Central and East Asia. The variant regulates how the body responds to thin air. A Sherpa at the altitude of Mont Blanc produces less extra hemoglobin in response to hypoxia than an Andean body at the same altitude, an almost paradoxical efficiency that lets them move through oxygen-starved air without the overproduction of red cells that, paradoxically, thickens the blood and strains the heart. It is the body solving a problem a layer of clothing cannot, and it only emerged in the Tibetans because, generation after generation, the mountain's survival question kept tripping that specific pressure on their bodies until the body returned a specific answer. In the Andes, a different solution settled in. Studies by Cynthia Beale of Case Western Reserve University, working among Quechua and Aymara communities of the Peruvian Altiplano at roughly 4,000 meters, documented populations with massive lung volumes, broad chests, and high oxygen-saturated hemoglobin concentrations that let them live as if the sea were 1,000 meters higher than it actually is. Different mountain, different answer. Same game. The fourth weapon wasn't on the mountain. It was waiting at the foot of the mountain. In the avalanche world, the worst place to be is alone. The best place to be is part of a community where someone will come looking. A buried, suffocating person has minutes. A village has hours. A region with a culture of rescue has days. In 1499, during the Swabian War, the Battle of Frastans in the Austrian Alps killed not just troops but whole encampments of soldiers caught in tactical snow. By the early 16th century, the monks of the great Saint Bernard Hospice, founded around 1050 by the Augustine Archdeacon Bernard of Menthon at 2,469 meters on the deadliest and highest pass between Switzerland and Italy, were already practicing what would become 3 centuries of organized rescue above the clouds. These monks understood what avalanche country requires, that you cannot stop the snow, but you can shorten the search. By 1660 or so they were breeding the dogs that would carry this logic forward. Between 1816 and 1818, the worst winters the pass had seen in living memory killed many of those very dogs in the very avalanches they were trained to navigate. If you want the modern state-of-the-art version of what those monks understood, look at what came next. On December 13, 1916, after abnormally heavy December snowfall and a sudden warming front, what Italian survivors would come to call White Friday buried entire barracks in the Dolomites along the Austro-Italian front. Estimates vary widely. Italian military histories have placed the death toll as high as 10,000 Austrian and Italian soldiers over a single week of catastrophic releases. A more recent reanalysis by the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, drawing on Austrian military records, suggests roughly 1,300 Austrian dead alone across the relevant dates, plus a comparable toll of Italians on the other side of the line. Whatever the true total, and the truth will probably never be settled, it remains the single largest avalanche death toll in recorded history. And it killed soldiers who had better equipment than any ancient herder. They simply did not have better knowledge of when not to climb, and their commanders ordered them into the wrong weeks of the year. Meanwhile, in peacetime, in the civilian Alps, the same lesson was being relearned. In Switzerland during the winter of 1950 to 1951, in the season locals now simply call the Winter of Terror, 649 avalanches buried 265 people alive across the Alps. 61% of those caught in slides never made it back out. Neighbors who dug with their hands recovered who they could. They had no transceivers yet. They had no probes. They had only what neighbors have always had. Hands in the snow, and the certainty that someone close would come looking. Today, that same neighbor network logic has been formalized into organized alpine rescue units in nearly every mountain country, with response times measured in minutes and survival rates that have climbed from 43% before 1990 to roughly 53% today, according to Rauch and his colleagues at URAC. Modern recovery is a triumph of community, refined to a science. Here's the part that lands. The archaeological and the historical record point at the same conclusion. From Otzi on a glacier in 3300 BCE, to Hafner's hunting artifacts at 2,756 meters near Schneidjoch, to the Roman coin hoards and a yoke melting out of the Theodule Glacier near Zermatt at 3,500 meters, to the ice-preserved finds still being recovered from retreating glaciers in the Yukon, British Columbia, and the Himalayas every summer. The human story on snow is the story of people who mostly made it down. Winter came at your ancestors with 4 weapons. The slab that hid in the snowpack. The slope that held it tilted at just the wrong angle. The season that woke it. The cold that buried you before help could come. They answered each one with their own architecture. They read the slope. They chose the calendar. They dressed the body. They sent the neighbor up after. They even, in the rarest of places, let their genes do the answering over millennia, quietly rewriting the hemoglobin in their children's children. Modern you, on the other hand, can book a heli-skiing day with avalanche airbags, digital transceivers, collapsible probes, and a beautifully designed forecast on your phone. You can buy the kit. You can have rescue helicopters on standby in Colorado, you can have groomed pistes in Chamonix, you can have avalanche beacons pre-rigged in Hokkaido. And you can still die in 12 seconds, because you trusted what the equipment couldn't see. Your ancestors had nothing to buy. They had what their grandparents had paid for in blood, transcribed into the places where their children's homes would stand, into the cabin doors that faced away from death gullies, into the months they simply refused to climb. Theirs wasn't a primitive system. It was the full system: knowledge, body, calendar, neighbor. Built over hundreds of thousands of human lives test-fitting it, and the living kept the parts that worked and discarded the parts that killed them. The rest of us call that tradition. They called it Tuesday. This is why the man on Tysonjock carries a copper axe. He wasn't hunting, and he wasn't lost. He was one of those test cases, walking home over ice at a season his grandparents had mostly survived. He's the reason we're still here to ask what he was doing up there at all. His footprints were a line, interrupted by a knife wound he never got to explain, and the line continues every time a child's great-grandparent paces a valley floor and says no. Outside tonight, somewhere in the high country, a slab is loading on a lee slope. The wind is doing what it has always done, redistributing snow the way rivers redistribute silt. The mountain will release when it's ready. And below it, in a village with no tourbus charm in its street plan, with stone barns tucked tight against the cliff wall and a south-facing roof and a door you have to walk a little out of your way to reach. Someone is sleeping through the dark because their great-great-grandmother decided their whole valley deserved to wake up alive. That is survival. Not escape. Not a piece of gear. A place chosen. A season respected. A neighbor trusted. And a stone laid where the snow should never touch your child.